you'll notice that there has been no debate in the United States, no discussion in the United States during this phase of the Accords on freedom of the press, say, in El Salvador. In fact, what we hear is they already have freedom of the press. And in a certain technical sense, that's true. That is, there's no law in El Salvador which says you can't have an independent newspaper. You don't need a law. There was an independent press in El Salvador in 1980 when the United States moved in to turn it into a Nazi-style terror state. There was a free press. In fact, there were two independent newspapers, not leftist or anything like that, mainstream independent newspapers, La Crónica and El Independiente. Well, they're not around any longer. In the case of, they were never censored because we hate censorship. In the case of one of those newspapers, what happened is that the U.S.-run security forces surrounded the office with tanks, destroyed it, drove the editor out of the country with assassination threats after several assassination attempts. That took care of one of them. In the case of the other one, our security forces, they're our forces, remember, our security forces picked up the editor and another journalist in a restaurant in San Salvador, took them outside, cut them to pieces with a machete, and left them in a ditch somewhere, or the rest of them. That took care of the second newspaper. So there's no more problem of freedom of the press in El Salvador, and you'll notice that none of these sudden libertarians who are so concerned about freedom of the press have called for a reopening of an independent press in El Salvador. Nobody's ever heard the words La Crónica and El Independiente. You hear about La Prensa, including many lies, but nobody hears about freedom. And of course, nothing remotely like this ever happened in Nicaragua. But you never hear a word about freedom of the press in El Salvador. In fact, these events these two newspapers, to be precise, there were 3 references to what I've just described in the entire 1980s in the New York Times. So you can't claim that we don't have a free press here. But it was so, if you're really a scholar and you got a terrific memory, you can remember that something unpleasant happened there, but it's certainly not an issue. We don't look into the question. Nobody calls for freedom of the press in El Salvador, and for 2 very good reasons. For one thing, Washington, the Office of Public Diplomacy, has ordered us that topic is off the agenda. We're not supposed to talk about that, so therefore, being loyal cowards, we naturally obey, so that's one reason. The other reason is that to call for a free press in El Salvador would be ridiculous. You can't have a free press in El Salvador without first dismantling the whole terror system that the United States installed precisely to ensure that you can't have things like a free press, or for that matter, Bible study groups that might turn into peasant self-help groups, and in fact, all the developments that caused Washington to unleash the terror apparatus. So since it's absurd to ask for a free press, I guess there's no point in doing so. In any event, no one asks about it. Meanwhile, I should say in Nicaragua, nothing remotely comparable has happened. The opposition claims harassment, and of course it always hits the front pages of the newspapers, but they're not expecting to be murdered or tortured. And this opposition is extreme. It's the kind of opposition which has never survived in a Western democracy in times of crisis. La Prensa, for example, and the groups around it, are openly support the U.S. attack against Nicaragua. Nothing secret about it. I just had I'm not sure it's happy experience, but experience of reading 3 months' worth of La Prensa. I must be the only person outside the CIA who actually has all of La Prensa since the time was opened in my office at home. And it's just openly pro-Contra. It doesn't even hide it. It's simply a U.S. government disinformation organ. I mean, to allow the journal to publish, it's as if in the United States during the Second World War, the media were largely dominated by Japanese fascist journals calling for the overthrow of the U.S. government and the liberation of, the territories in the Pacific from the racist murderers in the United States or something like that. I mean, such things are inconceivable. They never happen in the West. And the same is true of what we call the opposition, which openly identifies with the U.S. attack against Nicaragua and regards the U.S. as their only basic political support. They do get harassed and, they get censored and that sort of thing. They don't get murdered. In El Salvador, there's nothing even remotely similar. And so the press knows all of this, but will never report any of it. Inconceivable that they report these things, though every journalist in Managua and San Salvador knows it. Again, nobody is talking about the application of the terms of the Accords, which would permit an opposition, even a mild opposition, to function. Nobody's talking about those conditions. In El Salvador, that's off the agenda. And in general, all the simultaneity requirements are unacceptable because they would require the dismantling of the terror apparatus that the United States took such pains to impose and still supports. Now, another feature of the Accords that's unacceptable was international verification. The Accords had in them a provision for verification, an international verification commission, which included the 5 Central American countries, the Latin American democracies, the Contadora countries, the OAS, the Organization of American States, and the United Nations. Well, plainly that's unacceptable, essentially for the reasons I just mentioned. International verification would put barriers in the way of the U.S. attack against Nicaragua and the U.S. attack against the populations of El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras via the terrorist apparatus, the military regimes, which were either imposed or supported for that purpose. So that's unacceptable. Another reason why international verification is unacceptable to the United States is that the Latin American countries, though dependent, of course, on the United States, after all, we are the 800-pound gorilla, they're dependent on the United States and there are limits beyond which they can go. Nevertheless, they have a degree of independence. They have a degree of independence, and therefore they're not allowed in at all. In fact, nobody with a degree of independence from the master of the hemisphere is allowed in. So plainly, international verification has to go. And in fact, the demolition job on the Accords was completed by January. By January, the simultaneity condition was thrown out, international verification was terminated, and in fact, nothing remains of the Accords. They are finished. They are part of ancient history. Nothing remains of the Guatemala City Accords. The press may talk about the Arias Accords and so on, but either they're lying consciously or else they're unwilling to bother to look. The fact of the matter is there is nothing left of those Accords. What is left is a version of the Accords written in Washington and transmitted by the press and accepted by Congress, and that version says Nicaragua has to accede to arbitrary demands stated by the United States government, whatever they happen to be. That's the Accords. And that's all there is left of them. There's nothing left of the original text. Well, what were the means used to destroy the Accords? This is a very successful demolition job. What were the means used? Well, there were two kinds. There were military means and there were ideological means, you might say. The military means were, first of all, and most important, the intensification of the CIA supply flights. That was the most important event that happened during August to January. As I mentioned, the supply flights, which of course illegal to start with, were sharply intensified to about 2 to 3 a day, and also U.S. surveillance flights, which we have a very extensive surveillance apparatus, all the fanciest SR-71s and U-2s and satellites and spy ships off the coast and so on, are carrying out intensive surveillance of Nicaragua, and that was extended too. Now, both of those operations are significant. The supply flights are crucial, in fact critical, because, as is recognized on all sides of this debate, the Contras, the proxy army, are not guerrillas. They have no remote relation to guerrillas. The KGB doesn't fly 2 to 3 supply flights a day into El Salvador to keep the guerrillas in the field. And nobody's talking about sending humanitarian aid to the guerrillas. You don't have to, because they're part of the country. They're rooted in the country. They fight inside their own country. They've got their own network of support. In fact, the reason for U.S. terror in El Salvador has been to try to destroy that base of support. But they don't need supplies. They don't have to get, but the Contras, on the other hand, have to get everything from food to fancy communication equipment to boots to arms and so on, because they're not part of the country. They're a foreign implant. That's what it means to say. In fact, nobody really denies this is not a topic for debate. You know, the Reagan administration is the first ones to tell you that this force is going to collapse unless we continue to provide them with arms and supplies. The meaning of that, which they don't bother to tell you in the press, but you can figure it out, the meaning of that is they're not guerrillas, because nobody does this for guerrillas. And in fact, that's written into the Accords. It's well understood in Central America. You take a look at the actual wording of the Accords, and they say that the indispensable element for peace in the region is an end to any form of support. And then they mention military, logistical, propaganda, or whatever, to 2 kinds of groups, namely irregular forces and insurrectionist movements. Now, the distinction for that is that the irregular forces are the Contras, foreign organized forces attacking some country. The insurrectionist movements are indigenous guerrillas. and the indispensable element of the Accords is the termination of any form of support for them, any form, logistical or whatever, of course, as a corollary, the use of one country as a territory for insurrectionist movement, for irregular forces attacking another. In January, the International Commission, the Verification Commission, published its report. Now, that was plainly the most important thing that happened in January. Here's this commission made up of the 5 Central American countries and the Latin American democracies and OAS and the UN, had investigated all the countries. They finally came out with a report. Now we can finally get an independent, objective assessment of the compliance with the Guatemala City Accords. Well, it was mentioned in the New York Times. We have a free press. It got actually one sentence in the New York Times, buried in an article by James Lemoyne, in which he stated that the commission broke up in disagreement. Well, in fact, its report was unanimously accepted, but that was the total description in the news report on January 14th, when the report was issued on the 14th.